still a physicalist approach. All right, it's 5 minutes. Okay, you can go. Okay, we can criticize Chalmers in the following way. To many, it is inconceivable that experiences be ownerless. Okay, there cannot be an experience that is no one's experience. And if this is right, experiences cannot be understood as independent atoms. There must be a self. There must be something which has the experiences. And some people, they have done that. There are some approaches to the self, and some are still inside of this physicalist framework. And one of them is what people call emergentism. Okay? Emergentism is just the idea that from the proper base, some new powers, some new properties, qualities will emerge, but nothing new is added from the outside. So consciousness, thought, rational volition, and so on, they make their appearance naturally as a result of the structure and functioning of the human brain. So it is still an attempt to explain consciousness from a physicalist perspective. But we might ask, what does emerge? So William Haskell, he gives at least three possibilities. Mental events, properties, and conscious experience itself might emerge from the brain, right? The second, novel causal powers, so that now those mental states might causally affect the body. And third, the self, a self might emerge, something that has the experiences and exercises the causal powers. Okay, so it's a good instance of an attempt. Many people criticize this kind of approach. It has many problems. Okay, but it's an interesting way to see that people are getting more and more aware of the need of taking a self into account. And with that in mind, I finally, perhaps I have 3 more minutes. I finally get to what I call my contribution, that I call methodological dualism. So we have somehow like a case for dualism here. I won't explain, and I have already explained that we have a case for the methodological. Explanation should come first. Okay. So given that, we can propose what I call methodological dualism. It's just an idea, right? In the best spirit of philosophical speculation. So that could be defined as the view that as far as the explanation of mental phenomena is concerned, science is allowed to appeal to a substantial self, soul, or ego that is not identical to the body, and it is the bearer of personal identity and consciousness. So alike to methodological naturalism, also we don't make any ontological claim about the existence or non-existence of such an entity. But there is an asymmetry that we have to note here between methodological dualism and methodological naturalism. While methodological naturalism doesn't claim neither positively nor negatively about the existence of the non-physical, methodological dualism, it makes a claim, a positive claim about the existence of non-physical. But it is a claim that should be understood from the perspective of explanation only. But we might wonder, is that possible at all? Okay. The first concern we might have is about the non-observable character of this self, right? Well, it is not observable from a third-person perspective, sure, but we might say, and we might defend, it is observable, or at least we can experience it from a first-person perspective. Another way to answer that is to point out that in physics there are what philosophers call theoretical terms. There are terms which refer to non-observable entities like atoms and even forces, and we have dark matter and so on and so forth. So there are terms which are part of a theory, or at least they are implied by the theory. They have an explanatory role, okay, but they don't refer to anything that can be observed. So the fact that it can't be observed it does not imply automatically that it can't be used in a legitimate way in a theory. But this answer depends on the fact that it is not true right now, that we have explanatorily successful dualist theories. Okay, the second reply. The second concern is whether or not explanation can be done without ontological commitment. We might wonder that. Is that possible? Well, from a naive perspective, I would say that it can't. Perhaps when a scientist puts forward his theory, he has some belief that the theory refers to something in reality. But from a more philosophical perspective, I would say that it can. It is possible. For instance, when we take a look at the debate about theoretical terms, some people say yes, they refer to real entities. Other people say they don't refer to real entities. So it's an open question whether or not these theoretical terms refer to something in reality. But still, these terms are used in the theories and they are accepted as scientific terms and so on and so forth. And finally, I will take just 1 or 2 more minutes. I know that my time is out. We might wonder that the consequences of that, we are rejecting methodological naturalism, a very successful methodology or strategy, but we are not rejecting methodological naturalism. We are rejecting a specific version of naturalism, which is physicalist naturalism. For instance, if you go back to my early definition of naturalism, there was another way to understand naturalism, which is called scientific naturalism. The idea that science should do, that the natural is what is started by science. So if by chance we have dualist theories which successfully explain consciousness, successfully explain mental phenomena, the very concept of the natural would be expanded, like Chalmers proposed, so as to include this idea that there is another self. Okay, finally, I'm going to conclude. So, repeating the main question, does dualism have a role to play in the project of rationally explaining consciousness? I'd say that it must have. First, we have, as I tried to show, a case for dualism. We have a case for the methodological, and I put forward this new concept of methodological dualism. But more, if we do accept Popper's idea of theoretical pluralism, if we have dualist theories and say by chance that they do successfully explain consciousness, so the very concept of the natural will be expanded, and then perhaps we go beyond dualism in the way that the physical and the mental, they will be obviously different, but at the same time they will belong to a larger, broader category, the category of the natural. So now perhaps we can take this as an instance of this old thesis, which is called Beda Beda. The idea is an Indian thesis or doctrine. The idea that reality is at the same time different and non-different. Okay, thank you so much for the attention.
So our last session before we break for lunch today is something quite different. We're going to have a chance to hear from all of our speakers on a panel, and we're going to change them up just a little bit. We're going to start, instead of fielding questions from you, we're going to allow our speakers to ask questions among themselves. Are there things that they've heard in some of the other presentations that they would like to query? If you look inside your bags, you will find that there are cards there. Those cards are for you to write your questions down. The staff will collect those cards. They'll come up here to the podium, so you will also have a chance to present your questions to our panelists. At this time, I would like to ask Stuart Hameroff, Lou Ritz, Brenda Dunne, Howard Resnick, Martin Fleming, and Ricardo Silvestre to come up and join us here on stage. Thank you. It's Brazilian rules. So it has to be music. All right, so just to get, you going to make an introduction? All right. I think we can just get started by offering our speakers an opportunity to volunteer your own questions among yourselves. Is there anything that any of you would like to ask of your colleagues here on stage? Yes, Professor Silvestre.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question to Brenda, the same one that I asked you when you were there. So very interesting your talk, but if I understood you well, it seems that there's no place for the concept of objective, the way that you, at least how I understood you, which seems to me perhaps a little bit disturbing, because this is a very important concept for many things that we do, and in many ways we see the world, and even when we take, for instance, metaphysical aspects, like many people believe that morality is objective, there are objective moral truths. So if there is no objectivity, so again, it's just the way someone views anything, like moral stuff or whatever.
I didn't mean to imply there was no such thing as objectivity. There is, and I highly respect it, and I don't think you can do science without it. However, the point I was trying to make is that objectivity and subjectivity are not necessarily two different things, but two different ways of interacting with things. So let's talk about human relations. One can interact with a person from a very, well, we could talk about Buber's concepts of I and it versus I and thou. There's an objectivity there, but there's also a dimension of subjectivity. I am here, you are there, and I can interact with you as if you are something separate from me, or I could choose to interact with you from the point of view of some commonality that we have that draws us into a perhaps you could call it a more resonant interaction. They are both possible. They are just two different ways of perceiving the event that's going on, namely our interaction, objectively or subjectively. And it has to do with the experiential aspect of it versus the external. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, but what if they conflict, the objective and the subjective? If they conflict, how to solve that? How to pick one of them?
Okay, I don't know if I can answer that because I don't know. But it seems to me that the conflict lies in the fact that one regards the two perspectives as being contradictory versus being complementary. Namely, there are two perspectives. They are not two different experiences. You know, the grapefruit.
I know.
So,
contradiction
I don't understand how the subjective and objective. Could you give us an example of a subjective-objective contradiction? Because nothing came to mind when you said that.
Well, first of all, I can give examples of two subjective views which conflict.
Obviously, subjectivity can be that people disagree. Yeah. But what I wanted is an example where we clearly have something objective, and yet someone, let's say, is being subjective and just doesn't accept the objective. I don't understand how that conflict could occur.
Yeah, perhaps I should ask Brenda's help. Because to me, we can speak about two subjective views. If you say that there is a subjective and an objective one, so of course the objective one will be perhaps the right one.
We need an example.
I don't have.
And I don't have
I
an
have
answer,
examples
so
of two subjective views, but not.
Let me comment on that. The subject-object split is also referred to as the Heisenberg cut, and I think is equivalent to collapse of the wave function, when the wave function collapses, there's a subjective experience which results in material states that are objective, and I think that's what it is. Heisenberg cut, subject-object split, collapse the wave.
One other thing I think Brenda mentioned at the beginning of her talk, which I took as being the way that we bring objectivity into subjective readings, is we aggregate them. When you aggregate many subjective experiences and you find that they're common, you actually have an objective analysis.
That's another thing. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, it is really a question of whether an interaction is, well, if you will, scientific or spiritual. When I am experiencing something as a scientist, I am separating myself from it. When I'm experiencing something as a spiritual seeker, I am trying to merge with it and not separate myself, but to become one with it. That's sort of a way of saying the subjective versus objective perspective.
I would say that as long as what we don't mean, English, as long as what we don't mean is that, let's say I have a subjective experience, let's say some kind of spiritual experience, whatever it is, and I see nothing in science that can contradict that. I think that philosophical materialism masquerading as science could contradict that, but not science. I think that's a really, and there's too much philosophical materialism masquerading as science. If I could throw in one thing here, actually since I have a microphone and probably can, and that is the whole quantum headache or the quantum whatever it is, or the that exciting thing with quantum mechanics. There's one sense in which it's not the point. I'd like to explain what I mean by that. I watched this PBS special on quantum mechanics, and the narrator made a claim which I found philosophically absurd, in which he said that, I am all these billions or whatever they are, you mentioned the number 86 billion things, and that I am, and I thought philosophically that's absurd. That's just your opinion. So I want to introduce the idea, and I'd like to get these learned people to respond, and that is the concept of what I call teleological phenomenalism. And by teleology, the Greek word telos, purpose, aim, goal, that teleology studies purposes and their extrinsic purposes. For example, I decided to come to this conference. I was honored to come, so I gave myself a purpose, and that's extrinsic. But then you could say there are intrinsic purposes, which means whether you recognize it or not, you really should do something, even if you don't take it on as a purpose. In other words, when you're born, like, why was I born? And the idea there's an objective answer to why you were born. And also want to introduce the idea, crucial distinctions Plato made through Socrates and the Phaedo, which is the fallacy of conflating how and why. For example, when I was a kid, I was told that we now know why the sky is blue, but of course atmospheric science has no clue whatsoever as to why the sky is blue. They know how the sky is blue. To give a simple example, if someone's, because of course I'm using the words in a special literal sense. If someone says to me, why did you come to Gainesville? And I say, I flew from Los Angeles, I didn't understand the question. If someone says, how did you get here? And I say, I wanted to participate in the conference, I didn't understand the question. And so the idea that science knows why the sky is blue is conflating how and why, which creates a lot of confusion. So if you say why, you're asking, in this sense, for a teleological response. Like, what's the purpose of that? And so if, let's say hypothetically, because, that's how logic works, if, let's say someone made the world, and let's say the sky is blue because it was an artistic choice. Just like if, for example, if I'm looking at a great work of art and I say, why did the artist paint something in a certain way? It's an artistic choice. So here's a simple question. Who really understands a great work of art? is it a qualified art historian or a chemist that does paint? And so to me, of course, paint chemistry also certainly is valuable in its own way. But I think there's a higher sense in which the person that really understands the painting is the art historian. So bringing that back to why the sky is blue, to say that, as this person did in this PBS thing, that this is reality. Quantum mechanics I think it is reality. I love science when it really just does science and not philosophical materialism. But there could be a higher reality. There could be purpose. There could be teleology. And phenomenology means it's about taking your sense experience, what you actually see. When I see the blue sky.
30 seconds.
Okay. But I mean, I know I'm taking a lot of time, but I really want to get this out. It's an important thing that when you look at a painting and see the blue sky, you were meant to see a blue sky. You can analyze the chemistry of the paint, but you were meant to see a blue sky. So teleological phenomenalism means that we were meant on purpose to see the world a certain way for some purpose, which can be self-realization or however you want to define a spiritual experience. And so the idea that science is telling what the world really is, I think, is a philosophical blunder that has no basis. And when you were speaking, just to make sure I offend everyone up here, that and this is the last thing I'll say about this. I'm kind of uncomfortable with the discussion in which, again, empirical science, which I respect and admire and use all the time, is the gatekeeper. Like everyone has to come before the king, or it's like the Roman Colosseum where the emperor puts his thumbs up and you live, or thumbs down and you're thrown to the lions. I don't see empirical science as having that role because of the issue of teleological phenomenology.
Martin.
Thank you, Howard. I think one thing that came out from several of the contributions this morning on this particular point is that there has to be the recognition that the empirical process of science is looking at the properties and functions of that stuff we call the world. It's not really looking at its substance. When we break down, what is water? Okay, we say it's a fluid, but then we realize that those properties are from its molecular. What's the molecules made of? What are the atoms made of? What are the subatomic particles? We get down to energy and information, which ultimately manifest properties. And all we ever do in science is look at what things are like and what they do. We actually never get to know what they are. And what was being suggested, I think, several times this morning, I think it's very important for science, is that we treat consciousness in the same way. And this gets over the dualistic problems, and I think real thanks to Ricardo on that analysis. Methodological dualism. We start analyzing consciousness in terms of what it does, what it is like, how it interacts, and not worry about this thing about what is it made of. We don't know what matter is. How can we ask the same question for people to define consciousness? If it's not neural, then what is it? That is a bad question. You tell me what physical matter is first, then I'll tell you what consciousness is made of.
Thank you. Here's a question for Professor Hameroff from the audience. How is sense perception present in consciousness without physical sense organs? For example, near-death experiences, hovering above a comatose body and mind when revived, relating what was seen and heard outside of the body and brain.
Well, the first question is, how do we have normal consciousness in our brain? And what Roger Penrose and I suggest is that it goes down below the level of neurons, below the level of microtubules, into the quantum realm, and then touches space-time geometry in which qualia are encoded and embedded. So blueness of the sky, and maybe even understanding of a work of art, are made up of qualia which are embedded in the structure of the universe, much like spin, charge, mass, whatever mass is, curvature in space-time, are encoded and embedded. And the brain takes these qualia and puts them together into, like an artist taking a dab of this paint and a dab of that paint to make a painting, a masterpiece. And that's what the brain does, the microtubules do. They take all the different qualia, put it together into the conscious experience, excuse me, that we have. And I might say also that blueness of the sky If you apply the inverted qualia problem, your blue may be my red. So what you see is a blue sky. If I could be in your brain, your microtubules, I'd see a red sky, something like that. We don't really know. Similarly, understanding and appreciating a piece of art depends on, you may see it, understand it differently than I do. Now, if consciousness is related to space-time geometry, which is much, much smaller, faster processing than what goes on in the brain, even in the microtubules, what I mentioned last night is that it's possible that when the body fails, the blood stops flowing, the oxygen stops being delivered, that the quantum information that makes up consciousness that's connected to space-time geometry can exist in principle independent of the biology and can dissipate to the universe at large, so that in principle it's possible that, but remain together and by entanglement. So you have something like a quantum soul. Now, I don't have any proof of that. I do think that there's so many examples of out-of-body experiences and evidence suggestive of reincarnation and so forth, that something like that probably is happening. But as I said last night, if you address a conventional scientist and they say, no, that's impossible, until they or someone can explain consciousness in the brain, you cannot rule out consciousness out of the brain. So we have to know what consciousness is under normal circumstances, and that also applies to spiritual experiences and enlightenment and so forth. Those are all wonderful, and we strive for them, but the real mystery is consciousness of any kind. You stub your toe and you feel pain. That's a mystery. Also, you know, the wonder, being in the wonderment of the universe, that's also a mystery, but they're kind of the same mystery. Now, how are they related? I think deeper level enlightenment, spiritual experiences, even out-of-body experiences, are at a faster, smaller, higher level of the universe. And you go, as you go, it's kind of paradoxical. As you go down in scale, you go faster, smaller, but you get to the quantum realm where there's non-locality and everything's connected, and then you get vastness. So even though you're going down smaller, you get to this quantum realm where everything's connected. And I think that's what happens in so-called near-death and out-of-body experiences.
Thank you. Brenda, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'd like to just ask you to clarify something that troubles me. It seems that your model or approach takes an implicit assumption that space and time are independent of consciousness. It seems another way of looking at it might be that it is consciousness that creates space and time as a way of organizing its experience, of creating a framework, shall we say. Could you just clarify whether you see space and time as out there or in here or possibly both?
If you're an idealist and you think all there is consciousness, then you don't need reality, you don't need space and time. But then you have the problem of what is consciousness. It might be all there is, but then what is it? I would say that consciousness is a process in space-time geometry. So 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time. This metric that Einstein described, not dissimilar to what Vedic and spiritual traditions talk about. And it's hierarchical, multi-scale, and consciousness can occur at various levels within it. As you go down faster, smaller, you get quantum and non-local. So I think consciousness is quite literally a process in the very fabric of the universe in space-time geometry. So I think we need space-time geometry. Again, if you're an idealist, you can say, okay, we don't need it. Consciousness is all there is, but then you have to explain what consciousness is, where it's happening, in what vessel it's happening with. So I like reality most of the time, not always, and I think we need it.
Can I reply to thank you. I'd like to reply to something that Stuart said, that regarding the fact that, for example, my blue may be his red, or people have different reactions to art and so on. I would say that there are differences, and even in science, obviously there's different theories, but I think that the amount of cultural consensus or historical consensus about, let's say, about art or about colors and so on forth, is at least as much as the degree of consensus in science. And so I don't see an amount of consensus that would kind of tilt us towards some type of radical subjectivism. And again, if I could just try to sell this used car one more time. From the point of view of teleology, this discussion, for example, about space and time is kind of, I mean, nuts and bolts in the sense that, for example, I personally am not a technical person. You can see I'm totally humanities. And so when I turn my computer on and let's say it works, there's all these miracles of computer technology, and for me they are miraculous. But ultimately, to me, that's for the technical people, and I'm grateful to them, and I think they're brilliant, but I just want my computer to work. And so in the same way, according to this teleological view, the experience that we have of space and time, however we're programmed to get it, whether it's inside or outside or both, ultimately the most important things are understood by experiencing the world as we see it, and then in a sense the spiritual path, whatever spiritual path one is on, would then try to understand what things ultimately are more than just the technology of how the particular phenomenology popped up.
Question
Well,
here.
I'm a scientist. I want to know why it's happening. And as far as teleology and purpose, as I mentioned in my talk, I think consciousness came first. If you're a panpsychist or a religious person, you would say, I think that, or follow the quantum approach that I follow anyway, you would say consciousness was in the universe before life began. And as I made the point last night, life may have originated and evolved to access consciousness, maybe even pleasure, to optimize pleasure. So teleologically, we're living and evolving to feel good. And to feel good may be hedonistic, pleasure, or it could be altruistic pleasure, better to give than to receive, or spiritual pleasure. There's all different varieties. But I think consciousness and feelings, and good feelings, are driving evolution. So that's the teleology, not only of life, but even the universe. If the dimensionless constants are changing and mutating, then the universe is also evolving over eons to optimize conditions for consciousness because of the anthropic principle and that's the fine-tuning problem.
Question for Lou Ritz. If people here were interested in starting meditation, what would you recommend they do?
Sit still and be quiet. No.
Does that include the people on stage here?
There's so many different meditation techniques. It's like the word exercise. It's like the word exercise. If someone tells you how you exercise, there's all sorts of ways to exercise. So when it comes to meditation, in my way of thinking, it depends on what your goals are. You can use meditation to calm the body, to reduce stress, to learn how to be more compassionate, to be able to focus your attention. There's lots of different things that's associated with meditation, but to me, the spiritual goals are ultimately the most important. But whatever you do, I think it's very important to be able to quiet your mind. A psychiatrist at UF came up to me some years ago and said, "I'm looking for somebody with a profoundly quiet mind." And I wasn't sure who to point him to. Who knows what they're experiencing? There's lots of techniques out there. Choose one that fits you and your goals and go for it.
Thank you. Question for Brenda Dunne. I'm going to summarize this because it runs 2.5 reams. Can you give us a little bit more of your research? I think people are fascinated by things that you've discovered. They're mentioning specifically the experimenter effect. There's also, can you talk about some of the meta-studies? I'm going to leave it at that.
Can I have the rest of the day? And part of tomorrow? Well, let me say that we have written numerous papers and a couple of books that describe that research in as much detail as you could possibly want. And I'm not sure that this situation is the place to go into it. But basically, there were two aspects of investigation. One was to see whether the human intention could influence the performance or the output of random physical systems of various types, ranging from the microscopic to the macroscopic, and the other being whether people could acquire information, well, not so much whether people could acquire information about remote locations, but whether the information that they appear to have acquired could be quantified in a more reliable method than just saying, hey, that reminds me of this. We have found statistically significant positive answers to both of those questions. There are many aspects of it. We saw differences in the gender of operators, that, a lot of things that we didn't expect. So, well, let me go back to this first question. People ask about the experimenter effect. That implies that the experimenter somehow is controlling or producing the observed effects rather than the operators. Well, we did not study the operators. We were studying the machines. And all of our staff were operators as well as experimenters. Were we producing the results or the participants? And I think the answer is yes. I think that the experimenter influences the output or outcome of an experiment by creating an environment in which that experiment takes place. I know that we went to a lot of effort to maintain a warm and friendly environment in our laboratory where people would feel comfortable. If I may, an aside that just, I think, addresses the topic of the conference. When we first set up our program, we had to submit our protocols to the university's Human Subjects Committee to see whether we were conforming. Well, of course, since we weren't studying people, they couldn't find anything wrong with the protocols. So they wrote a wonderful letter back to Professor John saying, well, we don't have any problem with your protocols, except we feel it is imperative that your your subjects, which they refer to, do not end up with delusions of metaphysical capabilities. Well, I found that rather amusing, but that turned out to be a very valuable piece of advice, because when people would come into the lab, and they might be a little nervous, what if I don't succeed, and I would explain to them that before they embarked on the experimental process, it was incumbent upon me to tell them that no matter what happened as a result of these experiments, they should not leave thinking they were God, unless, of course, they thought they were God when they came in and we didn't want to disabuse them of that. Well, they would react the way you folks did. They would laugh. Okay? There's your experimenter effect. They laughed. They became more relaxed. They weren't intimidated anymore. We were friends. Mm-hmm. We had shared a joke. That's the experimenter effect. Okay? You cannot separate the variables that go into these experiments in a distinguishing way and by differentiating them. What goes into this is the integration of all of the variables: the operator, the machine, the staff, the environment of the laboratory, the intentions of the people. It all is part of one big thing. You can't tease out pieces of it and explain what's going on. So I don't know if that answers the question. It was a long question. Let me just say that if you want more information about the experiments themselves, there's more detail than you could possibly want in our books, Margins of Reality or Consciousness and the Source of Reality. There's also the book Quirks of the Quantum Mind that describe the theoretical speculations. And there are all kinds of technical papers that you can download from our website, which is www.icrl.org. Otherwise, I am going to take up the rest of the weekend, and all the other speakers are going to get really annoyed with me. And right now, I'm feeling sort of friendly and you know, loved, and I don't want to spoil that.
Martin, just before you respond, I'm going to jump in with a reflection from my own field. In Holocaust witness testimony, the conditions under which the discussion, the interview is taking place, radically affect the quality of what people's memory provides. So that in a circumstance, for instance, where the environment may feel tense or hostile, there'll be a defensive kind of recollection of events, sometimes even grossly distorted from what history would tell us. In other situations where there's a neutral, calm, friendly environment, and the interviewer knows to allow the witness to take charge of that experience, the quality of memory is quite different. Martin.
Just following on that, I think what you have identified is a really important principle in the study, the scientific study of consciousness, and particularly we can look objectively at its interactions. There has been some criticism, I suppose, of some of the pair results, not because of what you have done, but that they haven't been replicated or repeatable elsewhere. And my analysis of the circumstances of those other experiments is that they have contaminated their experiments by their state of consciousness. If the subject matter and the variable that you are looking at is consciousness, you need to make sure you've got a clean lab. And if your consciousness is, I will disprove this effect, you are already adding in contaminants to the process, and you are not likely to produce the same result.
One of the examples of that, Martin, that has come out was a criticism. Well, let me go back. We had a physicist colleague who was an optical physicist who thought it would be interesting to try our kinds of experiments on the sort of the well-known, yeah, it's so well-known I can't think of the name of it, the double slit experiment. Double slit experiment where you're trying to determine whether a photon goes through one opening or another. And we said, well, gee, that would be really great to do. Why don't you do it? And we'll be happy to support or encourage it any way we can. We even found him funding for the experiment. He carried it out and got no results. Okay? So he called us and said, hey, this doesn't work. I don't want to do this anymore, but would you be interested in having the equipment I used, We said, sure, why not? So he brought the equipment down to the Pear Lab, and I said to him, can you tell me what it was that you told your participants, so, if we're going to try to repeat this? So he said, sure, and he went into a very long, and I have to tell you, very tedious discussion about optics, and more than anybody would want to know. And he then came down to the statement of, well, there are some people who think you can actually affect this. And I said, I think I know why you didn't get results. Well, we took his equipment. We told our participants, hey, we've got a new experiment here. If you'd like to try it. It has something to do with optics. I don't really understand optics well enough to explain it, but I can get the information for you. But basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the line to go up or down. Would you like to try it? And most of them said, yeah, that sounds like fun. They tried it. We got very significant results. Same experiment, same protocol, different interaction with the people, different psychological consciousness was creating a different environment.
We have just a few moments left. I'm going to give a last question to the panel, and if you wouldn't mind, let's go down the line here, and perhaps each of you would give a brief response to this rather central question. What are the challenges involved in developing a scientifically rigorous, widely acceptable theory of consciousness? And then we're going to break for lunch. One sentence.
The conviction that it can be done. The conviction that consciousness cannot be explained through the standard physicalist approach, and we need a different way of looking at it.
Thank you. Lou?
We have to do the right experiment, and that's meditation as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Brenda?
We have to learn to ask the right questions instead of trying to prove that our answers are correct.
Very nice. Stuart?
The Templeton Foundation is sponsoring a program to look at theories of consciousness, and they identified 5 major theories, and they want to reduce the number, and they want to eliminate things that, so they're asking for experiments that would pit one against the other. And our theory actually is, the others are all neural based: global workspace, integrated information, predictive coding, higher order thought, and all of those could be correct, any or all of them, and still rely on quantum stuff and microtubules inside. So I've convinced them that for us, we want to just prove or disprove the necessity for quantum activities in microtubules, and how do you do that? And this would apply to any theory. And my proposal is anesthesia. And in a paper we published in Nature Scientific Reports last year, in 2017, we showed that that these terahertz blue light oscillations in tubulin and microtubules are sensitive to anesthesia proportional to the potency of the anesthetic to put someone to sleep. So if anesthetic A is twice as potent as anesthetic B, it should also, in putting a patient or an animal, any animal to sleep, it should also be twice as potent in inhibiting this oscillation, and that would make that oscillation or anything a good model for consciousness. And then there are other gases that are non-anesthetic that bind in the same place but don't cause anesthesia, and we show that they do not impair or dampen the oscillations. So I think that's the closest you can get. You could still say, well, why do those oscillations cause experience? And that is a separate problem, but I think that's the best we can do at this point. And so we'll see what happens.
Thank you. Professor Resnick?
I think we could learn from the field of positive psychology. Just for example, there's at the University of Pennsylvania, one of our best schools, there is an Institute for Positive Psychology in which they try to measure symptoms of conscious flourishing. And and just lastly, I think we should not come to the study with all kinds of presumptions and assumptions which favor a particular metaphysical philosophy. Again, we really have to separate philosophy from science, and it should be philosophically neutral, which means there are no assumptions either on the metaphysical side or the physical side, but just look at the facts.
Professor Silvestre?
Well, I think the first challenge is to rethink what we mean by the word science, because it has a history. I mean, it's a word that had different meanings throughout history. And in order to account for consciousness, we have to be open to rethink science and perhaps to abandon what Martin said, this heavy physicalist assumption.
You had a final comment?
I'd just like to make a final comment about Lou's presentation about mind-wandering, associative thinking. And it was a post that was forwarded to me by my daughter. And it said, "My mind is like my browser. There are 17 tabs open, 3 of them are frozen, and I have no idea where the music is coming from."
And on that note, please join me in thanking our panelists today. You're all excused for lunch. We'll see you back here in about an hour. Thank you all for attending.
Let me just give a little logistics for lunch and a few other announcements of interest. Tonight, technology allowing, we'll be showing the video, The Peer Project, for those who want to know more. We'll also probably show it tomorrow. And unbeknownst to Brenda Dunne, I'm inviting her She has some meetings tomorrow morning, but maybe in the afternoon we can do a breakout group on peer for those who want to know more. Pair. Yeah, pair of pairs. We'll set up tonight and tomorrow. So we will announce that. But a lot of people have said to me, I want to know more about the pair project. It's most fascinating. I also wanted to again thank our sponsors, and I did leave one sponsor off somehow, our biggest sponsor. Thank the Alachua County Commission for the tourist grant, and the Center for Hindu Studies for co-sponsoring, and Campus Krishnas for arranging the horn for us last night. And above all, our largest grant giver is the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust, the largest publisher in the world of the sacred literatures from India, and they are the primary sponsor of this conference, and we're very, very grateful. We do have a book table outside with books by various authors and speakers. Now, for lunch logistics, we have by the book table, there are 3 reserved tables. Those tables are reserved for those who are speakers today. So please respect the speakers. And we have a really delicious buffet. The buffet has descriptions by each item of what's in it. Some is vegan, other is vegetarian. It's all really good. We're running only 30 minutes behind, which is remarkable. And we will begin again at 2:15, which will put us 15 minutes behind. And enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much.